Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firestone. I'm usually joined for these shows by my friend, Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. Tonight, though, she wasn't able to make it, and so I'm going to have the honor of doing the show by myself. So, our topics for tonight are on the drone attack, the Iran talks, the Trilateral summit in Asia, and the dollar crown has slipped. Okay, a little bit. So please do like, share, and subscribe. And I'm going to get right into these topics. Well, let me share this on Facebook at first. As I was saying, we'll get right into the topics for tonight. With the first of our pieces, which is video. It's from Judging Freedom, and it's an interview, of Alastair Crooke. And I'll start the interview from about 5 minutes, the part we're going to deal with, about 5 minutes and 22 seconds in. So here we are.
Why did you cancel your Midjourney subscription?
I found this hidden AI that does everything I want for a one-time cost.
How do you interpret all this, Alastair?
Just the usual BBC propaganda straight out of Ukraine. There are bits of it that are vaguely correct, but it's just typical of the BBC. They're not reliable sources of news on Ukraine at all, I'm afraid. And this was the case. Yes, it was an extraordinary event. They had these trucks fitted with retractable roofs, and the drones had been manufactured and put within them, and that at a certain point they were placed very close. They were driven across by unsuspecting Russian drivers who didn't realize what they were doing in many cases, driven across, placed near to airports, and then the roof automatically retracted. They were using the Russian telecom system in order to have, if you like, a simultaneous retraction of the roof in next to five air bases in Russia. And then the drones flew and attacked or attempted to attack, because only two of them actually functioned. There seems to have been a malfunction in the retractable roof in several occasions, and in other occasions, the Russian defense systems took down the drones before they did damage. But in three areas, now there's no absolute confirmation about how much damage there has been done.
Okay, so I thought it was interesting that Alastair started out with the idea that the drone attack, the simultaneous drone attacks at widely varying places, in Russia, collectively constituted what was primarily a propaganda event. And he even stated that it was a BBC propaganda event. So basically, he's, while acknowledging that it was real, he doesn't see it or view it primarily as an event with a great deal of military significance or a great deal of significance with respect to the course of the war. But he sees its purpose as primarily psychological warfare, as primarily propaganda. That is very important to note, I think.
But it looks like that there were overall about 5 strategic Tu-95 bombers who were damaged, 2 possibly destroyed, 3 damaged heavily, but maybe recovered, a transport plane, and 1 other plane, which the Ukrainians have said was an AWAC plane, an A-50, but there's absolutely no evidence at all. So we're talking about the loss of about 5, maybe more in these areas, and it was right across Russia, the bases, as that documentary suggested, far away. But these had all been pre-positioned, and these were locally fired killer drones fired out of the back of a truck. And 5, probably 5. Now, Russia altogether doesn't produce these Tu-95s anymore, but they still estimated to have 45 to 55 of these in service. So it's not going to change the course of this history, not going to stop. In that big bombing raid, the Trump miscast and saying it was, they were just attacking for no reason, but which followed a similar failed drone attack on Moscow, which did actually close down the 4 Russian airports at the time. But it's not going to change it. It's not a threat to Russia's strategic nuclear capabilities.
Is it?
It's strategic, but there is one thing that is very important to understand, because I've seen a lot of comments saying, but the Russians had all their planes out in the open and they were lined up on the tarmac, and silly Russians. Actually, this is the requirement of the START and SALT nuclear treaties, that the strategic bombers have to be observable by visual and electronic means and out in the open. And the same applies, by the way, to American strategic bombers. They are also put out in the opening. But what this is
that point that the bombers have to be out in the open because that's required by treaties that are still in place. That point is a very, very important one, but it is doubted by many commentators. Now, I generally think that the information Alastair Crooke has is generally very, very reliable. I have found it to be very, very reliable. So I tend to accept his interpretation, but a number of other people have tried to confirm this. Okay, and the people who have tried to confirm it and who have been having trouble, some of the people I respect a lot as well. So I don't know what the truth is on this point, but it's a very important point. If the bombers were there to fulfill the requirements of treaties, it raises all sorts of questions. First of all, was the United States involved in this operation, in any way? If the United States was involved in this operation in some fundamental way, then the United States is violating the treaty that it signed and that is still in effect. Okay, specifically the START Treaty, because the United States knew the bombers would be at the airfields and would be out in the open. And yet the contention or the possibility or the question is, did the United States help the Iranians to plan this particular attack? And we'll come back again to this question as we move through the various articles we'll be talking about here tonight.
You know, we're entering a new era of war, because this is somewhat like what we saw with the attack on Hezbollah, using pagers that sow damage, and after which you can't really trust. You know, are you sure your telephone is safe any longer? And what we are seeing here is several types of what the Ukrainians called asymmetric warfare, but others would call terrorist warfare. There was just recently an assassination of a Russian general. A Russian who was unaware of it came up to him, and he'd been given a package for the general, and it was a bomb, and blew them both up and killed the general. Then we had the bridges which were destroyed at the edge of Bryansk region of Russia, and deliberately blown up so that they fell onto civilian trains, 2 trains.
Do you want to know where to invest $1,000 right now? Well, forget about AI, quantum computing, electric vehicles, cryptocurrencies, or robotics.
With many injured, many injured, and some deaths, that was traveling to Moscow. And now we've had this. But this is really important because, in a sense, this is the strategic nuclear. I mean, we're getting to the heart of the thing. Ukraine, supported by its allies in the West, has now bombed directly a part of the strategic deterrence which has got to be visible and out in the open under the treaties. So it's an attack on the main treaties, which are not with Ukraine, but were negotiated by Russia with the United States. And of course, the big question is that in the last few days, when Mr. Trump started talking about, look, if Russia doesn't do what I'm telling them, something really, really bad is going to happen to them. And then shortly after that, this happened. And I think the Russians are furious at this. They're furious in many ways. But think what that means more widely for all of us. You know, are we going to have to search every container coming into our countries in case it has a retractable roof, and drones, easy to manufacture? The parts are available. You can buy them off the shelf. You put them in, and then by remote control, someone fires it at the nuclear strategic deterrent of Russia or the United States or in the other countries. I mean, this is a new form of strategic war, which is highly dangerous for the future.
Yes, look, the possibilities are endless, of course, but they're the possibilities not just for the United States, but for all nations. That the shipping containers, that we get could be shipping containers with retractable roofs, and full of drones. Now, this is not something anybody can do. In the case of the Ukrainians, they had to plan it for 18 months, and they had to implement it for 18 months. It was an expensive operation, and it had to be done very, very carefully. It would require considerable capability to do it. But right now, there are many nations that have or could easily get such a capability, and who could use the capability to attack other nations that they have serious problems with it. For example, 2 nations that might use something like this, God bless you, honey, would be India and Pakistan. Of course, the Israelis are prime candidates for using, something like this against Iran. And just many, many nations that have problems with other nations, might consider using techniques of this kind. So this makes the world a much more dangerous place, especially if these attacks are carried out on countries that have a strategic capability with nukes. Uh, After sustaining an attack such as this upon their capability, they may decide to, to nuke another nation. So the possibilities of nuclear war have just been ramped up by the reality of this kind of attack on, on, on Russia by a much smaller power, specifically by Ukraine. So
The Western media this morning is reporting the loss of about $7 billion in Russian aircraft. Is that a number you question?
Oh, totally. That implies that they destroyed 41 of these Tupolev 95 nuclear capable bombers. It's nonsense. There were only a handful or total. We don't know the exact number because the Russian Defense Ministry hasn't said very clearly. But what we see, I mean, the satellite photography, and we can see roughly what's happened at the various. As I say, for 3 of the areas, there was a malfunction or it didn't happen. And that these figures of billions of losses, 1/3 of their strategic bombing capabilities has gone. But the question is, who's behind it? Was Trump informed? Did he have foreknowledge? Clearly, we've been told by the New York Times 2 months ago that the CIA are in charge, along with their allies in Britain and Israel, in charge of the intelligence for attacking deep into Russia.
Well,
Did Trump?
What we've been told, of course, is that the CIA has control over the FSB in Ukraine, the Ukrainian secret police. Or actually, they're the equivalent of the CIA, the intelligence organization, inside of Ukraine, which actually specializes in sabotage and attacks on other countries. So, so the question is, when did the CIA know about this? And was the CIA involved in the implementation of it, at all? And of course, the CIA is America. So, the other issue, of course, is whether Trump actually knew anything about it.
No. If not, why not?
Installers who frequently drill holes should try the popular Wu Steel 4-blade sawtooth drill bit. It features.
And what does that mean for the talks now?
I mean, you're familiar with international use of intel. Is it even conceivable that something of this magnitude could have been orchestrated without the involvement, not just the knowledge, but the involvement of MI6 and CIA? I'll ask you about Mossad in a minute. I don't know what Mossad would be doing,
exactly.
but certainly MI6 and CIA, no?
Absolutely. Of course it was. I mean, first there was a huge investment in these drones, building them, preparing and training people, then positioning all of these containers, passing them through into Russia and to trucks with these retractable roofs, making sure that they all work, getting into position. I mean, it was a very sophisticated operation. I admit that quite freely. But I don't think this was done just by Ukraine alone. That sort of operation has the sort of, I'm not saying there's any evidence for it, but I think it has the hallmarks of a Mossad operation. I think the train operation has the hallmarks, at least these were the operations at which Britain was so specialized during the last war in attacking the Germans during the occupation of France, OSS. Specialized in blowing up tracks and trains carrying civilians during the German occupation of France. I don't know who was involved, but certainly the CIA was at the apex of this
Why
cartel of
would
intelligence services.
why would Mossad be involved? Doesn't Mossad have enough to do with what's going on in the Middle East and with all their spying over here in the U.S.?
Certainly an interesting question.
There's been there's a long history going back to the Tsarist period of antagonism for supposed anti-Semitism in Russia. And we saw that with if you like, the Trotskyists in the United States, who formed the backbone of the neocon movement in the US. They have also a common alignment with the deep state and its objectives of destroying Russia, because they want to see American hegemony continue, because Israel depends on American hegemony. And if Trump is going to disrupt it by having a relationship with Russia, which is going to change many, many things, that is going to ultimately is going to affect Israel, because it is America that is, if you like, the backstop, the hegemony under which the mini hegemony of Israel can extend across the Middle East.
Very critical and important point. I won't say any more about it than that, but I think Alastair is right on the money.
What do you expect will be the retaliation? You said the Russians are furious. Is this enough to cause President Putin to reach the limits of his patience?
I mean, of course, I don't know, because this is what's being discussed at this very moment, I think, in Russia. But I think, yes, Putin has many things to calculate, but the country as a whole, I mean, the feeling is enough's enough. We need to get rid of this problem. And by that, I don't mean a political solution, but I mean a military solution. We need to finish this once and for all. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of feeling of that sort. So if anyone in America had the imaginings of Zelensky that, by doing this sort of operation, it was going to make Putin more liable, more flexible in the talks today, I think they're having a daydream. I don't know what they're smoking, because that's not likely at all. I do think that, I don't know if it's happening, I can't tell you, but I do think that Russia will nonetheless go ahead and present its probably quite tough terms, maybe even tougher today than yesterday, to the Ukrainians. The previous terms have already been refused by Russia, because they're just the same terms that Kellogg drafted, and asked, if you like, Witkoff to go and deliver them personally to Mr. Putin. And the Russians said, no, thank you, we don't need those terms. We've already rejected them.
If President Trump did not know about this, there's a very, very serious issue, I would think, in the command structure of the United States government. And if he did know about this, let's assume he did, how is President Putin going to be able to trust anything he says? While
they'll never trust him again,
Right.
if that is the case. Never trust him again. But also, we live in an interconnected world. What do you think the impact is on Iran? And Iran can see, what was being used, and they can suggest, when all of these threats are being made to Iran, the use of drones and through the port. You remember a port just suddenly accidentally caught fire in Iran, destroying a lot of the port infrastructure. I mean, they can put two and two together and say, okay, now we see what's coming. This is, we can't trust the United States or the West or Israel on this issue. I mean, it sends a very clear message. I mean, I think Mr. Trump will, at least privately to Mr. Putin, I don't know when they're going to meet, he'll have to explain what happened. I mean, because this is so serious. I mean, this puts the whole START and the SALT treaties into question. I mean, they are obliged to have them open and observable. And if what happens is the CIA then plans in coordination with the Ukrainian intelligence services to destroy them when they're out in the open, as required by the SALT treaties. I mean, there's going to have to be a really tough discussion, I think, there between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, and saying, well, where does this leave us? You said you wanted to deal with the nuclear issue, and instead of which your people, if it's not you, or if you did know, can we have an explanation for why you did this? Now, if there was a thought that, this was going to put pressure on Putin and Russia, this is actually so miscalculated as to be, I mean, this is such a dangerous move. Now, I don't think, since you asked me, I don't think Putin is going to overreact. I think there will be a reaction, but I don't think, he knows it's a provocation from those elements, and maybe he calculates, that this is a provocation against those elements within America who may not have told Trump what was coming, other than in the gentlest way, and said, something bad is going to happen to Russia, but didn't spell it out, and didn't spell out the fact that it undermined the whole nuclear agreements between Russia and the United States.
If that's the case, then when they presented this in a very gentle way to Trump, why didn't he probe further and find out what they were talking about? Find out what the specifics were. Find out exactly what the Ukrainians were planning and who else was involved in it.
I don't know, but I think Russia will take that as a possibility, and therefore there will be conversations going on, even now, I suspect, as the talks progress. But does it make it, the likelihood of a political outcome to these talks, I think the talks will continue. I don't think there's going to be a political outcome. I think there's escalation coming.
I would imagine that.
And I think Alastair is dead right. I think escalation, or at least retaliation, has already started. But we'll learn more about that as we move through. But whether there's going to be heavy escalation or not, I suspect it will be, and it will take the form of the use of Oreshniks, hopefully only inside of Ukraine. But I would not rule out the sudden appearance of Oreshniks in some of the European capitals, because after all, it's the Europeans who currently are agitating for more war.
The meeting in Istanbul, which was scheduled to start today, it's 8:30 in the morning in New York. It's about 3:30 or 4:30 in the afternoon in Istanbul. Would have been either acrimonious or fruitless at this point.
I think that's exactly what we may find. I don't know, what their tactics are, but certainly I think the Russians will present to Ukrainians terms which the Ukrainians then will say are unacceptable, and they will try and then mount pressure from Europe and into America to counter the Russian proposals. So, we may be in for a long haul, but meanwhile, the Russian forces are advancing very rapidly on the ground, in Sumy particularly. And the Ukrainians are just evacuating something like 100, 200 villages at a go in Sumy. It looks like, at least in Sumy, there's the beginnings of a sort of Ukrainian military collapse. So I think there's no doubt that Russia will increase the pressure on the Ukrainians during this time and push towards a collapse of their military. This has always been the objective, is to actually push it to the point where Ukraine can no longer fight.
Have you seen this?
So I think that's enough of that. We will close that off. It provides a very good context for the other articles that we are going to go through. Okay, so let's take a look at some of your comments now before we go to our second piece. Steve says, hello, everybody, both on YouTube and on Facebook. Robert Copeland, other sources are saying 40 airplanes were damaged or destroyed. Yeah, I noticed those are the Western propaganda outlets, including, by the way, the BBC. I think the BBC claimed 41 airplanes were damaged or destroyed. I think you'd be foolish to trust what the BBC has to say on this. Mr. Wonderful says, hello, everyone. Hello, comrades. Is Alastair Crooke going to comment to the damage to the Kerch Bridge that just happened? No, he did not comment on that. This video was done on Monday morning. I don't know if there was any damage to the Kerch Bridge at that time. But anyway, he did not comment on that. Even though I cut off the video a little early, there was no comment of that kind. Mr. Wonderful says, one of my friends had two of his friends murdered by Ukraine in acts of terrorism with the help of Britain using cell phone tracking technology called Anomaly 6. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Mr. Wonderful. Mr. Wonderful says, anyone can read about Anomaly 6 at the Gray Zone. Thank you, Mr. Wonderful. Hi, Robert. Joe Firestone, that nobody wins in a nuclear war. Yes, Robert, I completely agree. Nobody wins in a nuclear war. So let us hope that there is no nuclear war that breaks out as a result of these attacks. Mr. Wonderful's, the plane's attacks were out in the open because they were legally required to by international law, which is what Alastair had to say too, and what some other commentators had to say. But some other very good commentators have said they were trying to find confirmation of that, but couldn't find it. Robert Copeland said, Alice did a lot of speculation that may or may not be true. Well, he's doing analysis, and he's doing interpretation, and yes, it may or may not be true. I mean, he's not solely engaged in facts, he's also doing analysis. Okay, so we have to evaluate how good, that analysis is. But I think Alastair is very, very good at his analysis. Mr. Wonderful says, Mossad has long been aiding Ukraine's terrorist military, Azov. Well, the Azov people, of course, are Nazis, including Britain and NATO. NATO was sending ISIS fighters before the Crocus City Hall attacks. True, Mr. Wonderful. Proof Israel was arming neo-Nazis in Ukraine long before the Ukraine conflict. I dislike the use of the term neo-Nazi in this instance. I mean, I think these people are plain old Nazis. The only way they're neo is that many of them are relatively young people. The Nazis of the Second World War are mostly dead now. But that's the only way they're neo. In their ideology, they're not neo. And Mr. Wonderful said, see the Real News Network vid titled Israel is aiming Ukraine's blatantly in neo-Nazi militia, the Azov Battalion. Yes. Thank you for that. That's absolutely true. CIA has 12 CIA bases in Ukraine. Read the New York Times article titled The Spy War, How the CIA Secretly Helps Ukraine Fight Putin. Steve Wolfman says, hello, Doc. Hello, Steve. How are you? Mr. Wonderful says, Zelensky lost his only chance at escaping Ukraine with his life with these last peace negotiations rejected by Ukraine. Steve Wolfman says Russia will strike back. Absolutely. And Mr. Wonderful says there were not 40 or more planes damaged. The planes damaged were not particularly new or their damage in any way putting Russia at a disadvantage in order to deliver nuclear weapons with the plane at all. Well, what I have to add here is the following, that I don't think Russia relies so much on its strategic bombers for their nuclear deterrent. Okay, they do have a tripod type of deterrent, But of all the legs in the tripod, the weakest leg is the bombers, the strategic bombers. The importance means of actually delivering nuclear weapons, the more important means are their submarines. Their submarine fleet is now very, very good, if not the equal of the United States submarine fleet. But of course, their ICBMs and hypersonic missiles, of course, uh, are, shall we say, more modern alternatives to their strategic bombers, and the ones that are much more threatening to us, I think. So let us go on. The next piece on the subject is by one of our favorites around here, Scott Ritter. This is a piece Scott did a few days back on June 1st, and it's called Playing with Fire. The tagline is, Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb has crossed the threshold when it comes to triggering a Russian nuclear response. How Russia and the U.S. respond could determine the fate of the world. I have to agree with Scott about that. And here, of course, is a picture of the proverbial mushroom cloud. 2012, Russian President Vladimir Putin declared that, quote, the nuclear weapons remain the most important guarantee of Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity and play a key role in maintaining the regional balance and stability, unquote. In the intervening years, Western analysts and observers have accused Russia and its leadership of irresponsibly invoking the threat of nuclear weapons as a means of saber rattling, quote unquote, a strategic bluff to hide operational and tactical shortfalls in Russian military capabilities. In 2020, Russia published for the first time an unclassified version of its nuclear doctrine. Document called, quote, Basic Principles of State Policy of the Russian Federation on Nuclear Deterrence, unquote, noted that Russia, quote again, reserves the right to use nuclear weapons, unquote, when Moscow is acting, quote, in response to the use of nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction against it and or its allies, as well as in the event of aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy, unquote. The document also stated that Russia reserved the right to use nuclear weapons in case of an, quote, attack by an adversary against critical governmental or military sites of the Russian Federation, disruption of which would undermine nuclear forces' response actions, unquote. It certainly looks like the current attack of the drones was an attack by an adversary against critical government or military sites of the Russian Federation, disruption of which would undermine nuclear forces' response actions, unquote. And the interesting point here is that if it's true that 41 planes were destroyed, okay, in this attack, then perhaps that's an attack which would undermine the nuclear forces of the Federation, of the Russian Federation. So to the extent the 41 is true, the more likely it is that we'll see a reply using nuclear weapons by the Russians. On the other hand, if the analysts who are saying only 5 of the planes were destroyed are right, then it's unlikely that such a minor destruction of the strategic capability of the Russian Federation would cause them to reply with nuclear instruments. Anyway, that's just a piece I put forward for review and critique. In 2024, Vladimir Putin ordered Russia's nuclear doctrine to be updated to consider the complicated geopolitical realities that had emerged from the ongoing SMO in Ukraine, where the conflict had morphed into a proxy war between the collective West, NATO and the US, and Russia. Okay, the new doctrine declared that nuclear weapons would be authorized for use in case of an, quote, aggression against the Russian Federation and or its allies by any non-nuclear state with the participation or support of a nuclear state is considered as their joint attack. So here it is. Beginning to look like that this drone attack fulfills the condition that was just quoted. Certainly a case could be made that that is true. Anyway, quote again, Russia's nuclear arsenal, I'm sorry, it's not quote again yet. Russia's nuclear arsenal would also come into play in the event of, quote again, actions by an adversary affecting elements of critically important state or military infrastructure of the Russian Federation, disablement of which would disrupt response actions by nuclear forces, unquote. So again, the more likely it is that 41 planes were destroyed, the more likely it is that the nuclear arsenal of Russia would come into play. I don't like that conclusion. So I hope only 5 planes were destroyed. The threats did not have to come in the form of nuclear weapons. Indeed, the new 2024 doctrine specifically stated that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons to any aggression against Russia involving, quote, the employment of conventional weapons, which creates a critical threat to their sovereignty and or territorial integrity, unquote. Operation Spiderweb, the large-scale assault on critical Russian military infrastructure, directly related to Russia's strategic nuclear deterrence by unmanned drones, has demonstrably crossed Russia's red lines when it comes to triggering a nuclear retaliation and or preemptive nuclear strike to preclude follow-on attacks. The Ukrainian SBU, under the personal direction of its chief, Vasyl Maliuk, has taken responsibility for the attack. Okay. At this point, I have to say I think it was a very good thing that Russia developed the Oreshnik as a strategic weapon for use in Europe, because it gives them a way of responding which is proportionate to the threat that they just have gotten from the drone attack, but without actually having to trigger a nuclear retaliation and or a preemptive nuclear strike. Because if their goal is to preclude follow-on attacks by the collective West, they can probably do that with a set of Oreshniks in the right places. Just had to put that in there. Operation Spiderweb is a direct action assault on critical Russian military infrastructure and capabilities directly related to Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent capabilities. At least 3 airfields were attacked using FPV drones operating out of the backs of civilian Kamaz trucks, repurposed as drone launch pads. Dyagilevo Airfield in Ryazan, also Belaya Airfield in Irkutsk, and Olenya Airfield in Murmansk, home to Tu-95 and Tu-20T strategic bombers. An A-50 early warning aircraft was struck, resulting in numerous aircraft being destroyed and or heavily damaged. Again, it still is unclear at this time how many airplanes actually were lost or destroyed and or heavily damaged. I think the number is very important here. It had better not be 41. It had better be 5 or 3 or something like that. Scott says, this would be the equivalent of a hostile actor launching drone strikes against U.S. Air Force B-52H bombers stationed at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota and at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and B-2 bombers stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base in the Missouri. The timing of Operation Spiderweb is clearly designed to disrupt peace talks scheduled to take place in Istanbul on June 2nd. Scott wrote this before the peace talks. The peace talks did take place. I won't say they were disrupted, but I think the atmosphere was much more tense and hostile in these peace talks than it would have been if there hadn't been any attack by the drones. First and foremost, says Scott, one must understand that it is impossible for Ukraine to seriously prepare for substantive peace talks while planning and executing an operation such as Operation Spiderweb. While the SBU may have executed this attack, it could not have happened without the knowledge and consent of the Ukrainian president or the Minister of Defense. Moreover, this attack could not have occurred without the consent of Ukraine's European partners, in particular Great Britain, France, and Germany, all of whom were engaged in direct consultations with Ukrainian President Zelensky in the days and weeks leading up to the execution of Operation Spiderweb. The Ukrainians have been encouraged by Europe to be seen as actively supporting the Istanbul peace process, with an eye to the notion that if the talks failed, the blame would be placed on Russia, not Ukraine, thereby making it easier for Europe to continue providing military and financial support to Ukraine. There appears to be a major role being played by U.S. actors as well. Senators Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, and Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut, made a joint visit to Ukraine in the past week where they coordinated closely with the Ukrainian government about a new package of economic sanctions linked to Russia's willingness to accept peace terms predicated on a 30-day ceasefire, one of Ukraine's core demands. Operation Spiderweb appears to be a concerted effort to drive Russia away from the Istanbul talks, either by provoking a Russian retaliation, which would provide cover for Ukraine to stay home, and an excuse for Graham and Blumenthal to go forward with their sanctions legislation, or provoking Russia to pull out of the talks as it considers its options going forward, an act that would likewise trigger the sanctions action of Graham, Kay, and Blumenthal. Unknown is the extent to which President Trump, who has been pushing for successful peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, was knowledgeable of the Ukrainian actions, including whether he approved of the action in advance. Trump appeared to be ignorant of the fact that Ukraine had targeted Russian President Putin using drones during a recent trip to Kursk. How Russia responds to this latest Ukrainian action is yet unknown, The drone attacks on the military bases came on the heels of at least 2 Ukrainian attacks on Russian rail lines that resulted in significant damage done to locomotives and passenger cars and killed and wounded scores of civilians. Not to mention significant damage done to bridges that Scott does not mention here. But this much is clear. Ukraine could not have carried out Operation Spiderweb without the political approval and operational assistance of its Western allies. The American and British intelligence services have both trained Ukrainian special operation forces in guerrilla and unconventional warfare actions, and it is believed that previous Ukrainian attacks against critical Russian infrastructure, the Crimea Bridge and Engels Air Base, were done with the assistance of U.S. and British intelligence in the planning and execution phases. Indeed, both the Crimea Bridge and Engels Air Base attacks were seen as triggers for the issuing of Russia's 2024 nuclear doctrine modifications. Russia has in the past responded to provocations by Ukraine and its Western allies with a mixture of patience and resolve. Many have interpreted this stance as a sign of weakness, something which may have factored in the decision by Ukraine and its Western facilitators to carry out such a provocative operation on the eve of critical peace discussions. Here I have to comment, it was malpractice. If Trump knew anything about this at all, it was malpractice to allow the intelligence people to carry out this operation on the eve of critical peace discussions, because it's obvious that that kind of attack was likely to disrupt any such discussions. It was, if you knew about it, if Trump knew about it, it was stupid malpractice on his part. If he did not know about it, he's got a serious problem with the subordinates in his administration, and he's got to fire many, many people in the intelligence services, starting with them, but starting with their supervisors who knew something about this, but did not fully brief him on this. I mean, heads have to roll over this, because only heads rolling would convince the Russians that maybe Trump was deceived and was not involved in this. And for the future of peace discussions, giving that impression, whether true or not, would be very, very critical, in my view. The extent to which Russia can continue to show the same level of restraint as in the past is tested by the very nature of the attack. A massive use of conventional weapons which struck Russia's strategic nuclear deterrence force, causing damage. It is not a stretch of the imagination to see this tactic being used in the future as a means of decapitating Russian strategic nuclear assets, aircraft and missiles, and leadership. The attack against Putin and Kursk underscores this threat. If Ukraine can position Kamaz trucks near strategic air bases, it could do so against Russian bases housing its mobile missile forces. That Ukraine would carry out such an attack likewise shows the extent to which the Western intelligence services are testing the waters for any future conflict with Russia, one that NATO and EU members say they're actively preparing for. We have reached an existential crossroads in the SMO. For Russia, the very red lines it deemed necessary to define regarding the possible use of nuclear weapons have been blatantly violated by not only Ukraine, but its Western allies. President Trump, who has been claiming to support a peace process between Russia and Ukraine, must now decide as to where the United States stands considering these developments. By the way, I think Scott is completely correct here. I completely agree. Trump has now to decide where the United States stands. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has acknowledged that under the previous administration of Joe Biden, the United States was engaged in a proxy war with Russia. Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, recently acknowledged the same about NATO. In short, by continuing to support Ukraine, both the U.S. and NATO have become active participants in a conflict which has now crossed the threshold regarding the employment of nuclear weapons. The United States and the world stand on the precipice of a nuclear Armageddon of our own making. Either we separate ourselves from the policies that have brought us to this point, or we accept the consequences of our actions and pay the price. We cannot live in a world where our future is dictated by the patience and restraint of a Russian leader in the face of provocations we are ourselves responsible for. Ukraine, not Russia, represents an existential threat to humanity. NATO, not Russia, is responsible for encouraging Ukraine to behave in such a reckless manner. So too is the United States. The contradictory statements made by U.S. policymakers regarding Russia provide political cover for Ukraine and its NATO enablers to plan and execute operations like Operation Spider Web. Senators Graham and Blumenthal should be called out for sedition if their intervention in Ukraine was done to deliberately sabotage a peace process President Trump has said is central to his vision of American national security going forward. But it is Trump himself who must decide the fate of the world. In the coming hours, we will undoubtedly hear from the Russian president about how Russia will respond to this existential provocation. Trump, too, must respond by telling Graham and Blumenthal and their supporters to stand down regarding Russian sanctions, by ordering NATO and the EU to cease and desist from continuing to provide military and financial support to Ukraine, and by taking sides in the SMO. Choose Ukraine and trigger a nuclear war. Choose Russia and save the world. Scott Ritter is a former Marine intelligence officer with extensive experience at arms control and disarmament and an expert on U.S.-Russian relations. His work can be found at scottritter.com. He is the author of several books, including his latest, Highway to Hell, The Armageddon Chronicles, 2014 to 2025, published by Clarity Press. So, I will check your comments in relation to this article, see where you guys stand on it. I see we have a lot of comments. Okay, from Mr. Wonderful. Okay, Mr. Wonderful said at 9:29, Zelensky lost his only chance at escaping Ukraine with his wife. I read that before, so I'll go on. Steve Wolfman says Russia will strike back, and Mr. Wonderful says there were not 40 or more planes damaged. The planes damaged were not particularly new, or their damage in any way putting Russia at a disadvantage to deliver nuclear weapons with a plane at all. Steve Wolpern said we are too close to nuclear war. Mr. Wendell said the reason, I agree, Steve, by the way, we're much too close to nuclear war. It is very frightening, there's no question, and very reckless. Mr. Wonderful says the reason why the Western MSM were pushing Ukraine's BS narrative about Russia's planes destroyed when they weren't, while ignoring Ukraine's terrorism, is because the CIA control, America's, the MSM here in America. In 1948, the U.S. passed a law called the Smith-Mundt Act, which forbid the CIA to propagandize to the USA. In 2013, the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act was passed that allowed it. 1 year before the Euro Maidan in 2014. Yes, very true. 1996 Telecommunications Act was passed. It was an overhaul to consolidate all communications carriers of the United States under 6, owned by Zionists, for what? Media control, in advance of 9/11. Okay, Steve Hood says, I doubt 41 planes, probably more like 4. Yeah, I think more like 4 too. And Mr. Wonderful addresses Steve Wolpern, as I understand it. 13 were damaged and the majority, are repairable, while a few are out of further production. The fact is, Zelensky's media narratives about Russia before Russia's SMO to present have always been lies and debunked, while supporters parroting them, looking stupid, proclaiming it's Russian propaganda. I'm going to point out how minor these attacks on Russia's planes were using logic few have used. I may be first to say this via text over the internet, certainly on YouTube. Here's the historical average of spacecraft launches. Estimated total launches 1957 to 25, 3,300 to 35. Soviet Union plus Russia, 68-year history, 48 to 52 launches per year on average historically. Here is the historical average of spacecraft launches. That was repeated twice. Okay, with that in mind, Russia's average in launching spacecraft into space per year totals more than the nuclear bombers destroyed. Okay. Okay, I agree. Okay, but let us go on. So the next piece we'll go over. Oh, by the way, do share, like, and subscribe here. We have very low attendance tonight, undoubtedly due to the absence of Dee, who does much of the marketing for these particular streams. But please help out while she's gone by sharing and liking this particular stream. So far, according to my indicator, I have only 1 like, which surprises me because I think this is a pretty good stream. But anyway, let us go on. This is a piece from Larry Johnson. It was written on the 1st of June. Ukraine launches terrorist offensive with Western assistance on eve of negotiations in Istanbul. Another piece done in the similar vein to Scott Ritter's piece That's a picture of the down bridge in Bryansk, which was one of the targets of the drone attacks. Pretty good destruction of that bridge by those drones. A lot of workers here looking over the damage, figuring out what to do to replace it. So the Ukrainians, along with many of their Western backers, are giddy with joy over a terrorist attack on a Russian civilian passenger train and a drone attack on Russian strategic bombers. So that's basically stating that the attack on the Russian civilian passenger train was not a drone attack, that it was essentially sabotage. Ukrainian sources insist that they destroyed 1/3 of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. That is utter nonsense. Here is a more measured assessment of what was achieved, and this is a quote. In general, it may be too early to talk about this, but we think some things need to be clarified since the enemy IPSO is trying to use the information space and present its idle wishes as reality. What is this a quote from? It's a quote from a previous article on Sonar 21. Which is where this post is from, of course. First of all, let's see the number of hits. The enemy cites a figure of about 40 units, which allegedly make up 34% of the Russian strategic aviation aircraft. All Ukrainian information bases are now trumpeting this. Having analyzed all the videos published by the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and there are, of course, all of them, so we have no reason to hide the scale of Russian losses because they are obvious. So far, we have counted the hit at most 5 strategic bombers Tu-95. Of these 5, 2 are definitely beyond repair. Here we must add another IL-20, which will probably also be written off. On 3 U-95 aircraft, the fires seem to be localized, and there's a chance that if the fires are extinguished in time, they may be able to be put into service. As of this morning, the Russian armed forces had 58 Tu-95 aircraft in service. Even if we assume that all 5 aircraft burned down, this would be less than 10% of the Tu-95 fleet, not counting the 19 Tu-160 units and the 55 Tu-22 M3M units, the video of which the enemy did not post. It is known that of the planned strikes on 5 airfields, only 2 were successful. 3 strategic aviation aircraft were not damaged. Thus, according to confirmed data, less than 4% of our strategic fleet was disabled. And if we count heavy bombers, only Tu-95 and Tu-160, then it is 6.5%. Now let's consider the question of how much this will affect the strikes that the Russian aerospace forces will be able to carry out on the territory of Ukraine. Ukrainian sources do not use their reason, but a calculator and ceiling figures for losses that they simply invented, say by 1/3. In fact, these current losses will not affect Russian strike power in Ukraine at all. Here's why. The number of cruise missiles, KH-101, I think those are Kinshal missiles, the standard weapon of the Tu-95 used against targets in Ukraine, which this aircraft can simultaneously carry, is 8 units. In the last attacks, no more than 40 of these missiles were launched simultaneously. That's a full 6 aircraft. In other words, Russia needs only 6 combat-ready Tu-95 aircraft to carry out strikes with the same intensity as before. And there are many times more of them left. The Tu-160 should not be neglected either. They're currently participating in strikes. The reason is quite justified. These are newer aircraft, the service life of which is being preserved, and the Tu-95 should still be used and gradually written off due to the age of the structure. Perhaps even the current war will be one of the last in which this type of aircraft will be used. In my opinion, none of these attacks could have been planned and executed without assistance, if not the direct involvement of Western intelligence and NATO officers. The drones likely were activated by a remote signal made possible by Western satellites and/or systems such as Starlink. These systems also played a critical role in enabling the drones to navigate to the targeted airfields. Well, this is clearly a PR victory for Ukraine. It is a classic example of a victory, i.e. a tactical win leading to a strategic defeat. The Trump administration is denying any knowledge of the attack. I take that disavowal with a big grain of salt. People within the CIA and the US EU COM offices who are providing assistance to Ukraine likely knew about the plan and may even have provided intelligence support to get the drones to their targets. Like any covert operation, they may have tried to give Trump plausible deniability, but the Russians know how this game is played. Expect Russia will launch a massive retaliatory strikes after the talks in Istanbul on Monday conclude. The Ukrainian attacks on the bridges, the train, and airfields have done nothing to alter the situation all along the line of contact in Ukraine. News continues to pour in from the front, from both Ukrainian and Russian news outlets, painting a picture of growing desperation, even panic among Ukrainian forces, as Russians capture more territory and kill more Ukrainian troops. The thing to keep in mind is that the Russian leadership, not just Putin, are not going to react emotionally. I'm not suggesting they're not enraged. They are. But the Russians value brains and strategy over passion. They're calmly assessing these latest developments and will prepare and deliver some new blows. Oh, sorry. Some new blows on Ukraine that will signal a significant escalation in the weapons Russia will use on Ukrainian targets. I think that by the end of the week, Zelensky and his cronies will be singing a different tune. Well, it is now Tuesday. One final point, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a phone conversation with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, according to the Foreign Ministry of Russia. So far, the Russians have not provided a readout of this chat. Rubio reportedly expressed condolences to Lavrov over the recent attacks on trains in the Bryansk and Kursk regions. I'm pretty sure that Lavrov delivered a stern and forceful message to Rubio, which included a warning that Russia is prepared to use all necessary means to defend its people from terrorist attacks. I wonder if Rubio had to change his underwear following that conversation. ? I wonder that myself. Let's take another look at your comments. Okay, with that in mind, Russia's average. Okay, this is Mr. Wonderful's comment. With that in mind, Russia's average in launching spacecraft into space per year totals more than the nuclear bombers destroyed. Yes, I agree. But I still don't see the point. Evelina says, hi, Evelina, a little girl and her teacher were killed on a passenger bridge. Yes, I understand that. My point was, since Russia pumps out more spacecraft, and launches them into space per year that the bombers damaged/destroyed, why can't they replace them before the year ends? I'm quite sure they can if they want to. But the Tu-95 is no longer being produced, so they'll have to replace them with the 161s. I think those were the alternatives. So I think that could easily happen. Earl of Lurl is here and says, hello, Firestoners. Mr. Wonderful says, Earl of Lurl, greetings. And the Earl of Lurl acknowledges Mr. Wonderful. And to be clear, the statistic about spacecraft launches from 1957 to 2025 totaled 3,335 of Russian statistics regarding their 68-year history of doing so, averaging 48 to 52 launches per year. Thank you, Mr. Wonderful. Okay, let's move on to the next piece. Share the screen again for another piece from Larry Johnson. Is this from Larry? Let's see. Yeah. When it comes to metaphors, Ukraine sucks, while chances for a deal with Iran fade. And there's a picture of the news report from the New York Post on World News about the Ukrainian drone attack. Of course, this is a quotation from Kyiv. The editor of the New York Post, who signed off on this headline and came up with it himself, either displayed profound ignorance of history or was making a snarky observation about Ukraine's lack of strategic thinking. I think it is the former, but I welcome your thoughts about the latter. This was because the headline said Ukraine wipes out dozens of Russian doomsday nuclear bombers, dozens in massive surprise attack on air bases. Kyiv says, quote, Russian Pearl Harbor. So that was the headline that was being referenced by Larry here. Going on, the Japanese attack on December 7, 1941 was intended to destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers berthed at Pearl Harbor. But those ships were not there. They were at sea. Instead, the Japanese decimated and damaged several battleships. This attack launched the United States into World War II. I will defer discussing whether President Roosevelt allowed this attack to take place in order to rally the American public to join the war in Europe. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto reportedly said the following in the aftermath of Japan's great victory. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. We have won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war, which is, of course, what happened. Ukraine's destruction of an estimated 10 aircraft of varying vintage changes nothing tactically or strategically to give Ukraine hopes of stopping the Russian offensive on the ground. All it did was enrage the Russian public and further their commitment to defeating Ukraine and NATO. The Russian leadership has played this surprisingly cool. The negotiators met their Ukrainian counterparts in Istanbul on Monday and did not raise the attacks as an issue in the talks. I think Ukraine launched the drone attack in conjunction with the terrorist bombing of the bridge in Kursk and the bridge in Bryansk, which fell on a passenger train in hopes that Russia would refuse to proceed with the scheduled meeting in Istanbul. If that was their goal, it failed. Russia will continue to meet with Ukraine, but will not slacken its military campaign on the ground. Okay, and that is, thank you, honey. They will do, what Russia will do is war alongside jaw. as I forget who expressed it in this way, maybe Ray McGovern. Anyway, war versus George Jaw. Russia will do both. Russia presented, its memorandum, which simply repeated the position President Putin laid out on June 14th of 2024. Russia ain't budging. Russia did offer an exchange of 6,000 bodies and a temporary ceasefire to allow the Ukrainians to collect their dead along specific areas in the line of contact. In doing this, Russia was sending an unmistakable message about the nature of the casualties. Ukraine does not have 6,000 Russian bodies to deliver. This is a clever tactic to remind the Ukrainians about the true state of the war, and maybe to remind everybody else about the true state of the war. Turning to the prospects for the U.S. and Iran agreeing to a deal to guarantee Iran is not building up nukes. The hopeful indicators from last week, e.g. Trump reportedly telling state to stop work on Iranian sanctions, that a deal was imminent, is proving to be a chimera, a mythical animal. Iran is ready to make a deal. The U.S. is not one Iranian one of the negotiators for Iran, assessed the current status of the talks with his comment to the Middle East Spectator. At first glance, the proposal is assessed as incoherent and disjointed, very unrealistic, and with excessive demands. The fact that the Americans constantly change their positions has so far been the main obstacle to the success of the talks, and now makes the work more difficult than ever. The U.S. is changing its positions. Say it ain't so, but it is true. Specifically, quote, Witkoff, we won't allow Iran to enrich even 1%. CNN, actually, the U.S. is no longer asking Iran for, quote, zero enrichment, unquote. Reuters, the U.S. is insisting on zero enrichment. Axios, U.S. has changed its position, says Iran can enrich up to 3%. It's not enough. It's got to be 3.67%. Trump, Iran can't enrich at all. Trump's desire to make a deal with Iran, assuming he's sincere, is being buffeted by unyielding Zionist opposition, not only from Netanyahu, but from much of the political establishment in D.C. Zero enrichment is a deal killer for Iran. Trump's claim he is the master of making a deal is being exposed as a hoax. There is no agreement in sight for ending the war in Ukraine. The talks with Ukraine are stalled, and his imposition of tariffs has failed to produce a line of countries eager to, quote, kiss his ass, unquote. Only the UK's Keir Starmer has planted his lips on Trump's corpulent ass to secure a trade deal, which may say something about Starmer's sexual proclivities. Bodies. I discussed Ukraine's drone attack and terrorist strikes on bridges in a train today with Nima and with the judge, Napolitano. And there are the two videos appended to this blog. I leave them for your consumption. I'll check in with you again on your comments. Mr. Wonderfell's exactly, Joseph. Russia can simply replace their bombers with space-capable bombers and do it before the end of the year. Yeah, I know they can easily. The Earl of Laurel says Ray McGovern was quoting Winston Churchill. Yeah, Ray McGovern is great for his quotes. Very apt and very colorful. I'm proud to say that Ray is from the Bronx. By the way, I believe Scott Ritter is also from the Bronx. Of course, I am also from the Bronx, which is why I bring this up. Ivalana Brown says, Ukrainian general, head of defense, I believe, stepped down after Russian attack on training camp where several soldiers were killed, including foreign personnel. Wonder if this was in retaliation for the bridge. I think it was perhaps the beginning of retaliation for the bridge. And yes, that is what happened, Evelina. Thank you for your comment. So let us get on with this picture. Well, I guess what I want to say is those items, the two blogs from Larry Johnson, okay, the video from Alastair Crooke. Okay. Oh, so Earl of Merrill says, I'm a little from the Bronx. What do you mean you're a little from the Bronx? Earl of Merrill says, I saw that interview earlier too, laugh out loud. Yeah. Okay, so the Alastair Crooke video, the Scott Ritter, the Scott Ritter article, and the two pieces from Larry Johnson all dispute the idea that there were 41 bombers destroyed, and dispute also a lot of the other facts, quote unquote, which the Ukrainians were attempting to circulate. There are many others who dispute that, not just those three, but all manner of people are disputing the early accounts that were put out from Kiev. Those were propaganda by Kiev. That's all they were. And the assessments of what the reality was continue to pour in. And okay, they are that though the attack was an audacious one and an imaginative one, and brings up all kinds of possibilities which are very dangerous and very distasteful, some of which we went over in the Alastair Crooke video, and some of which I amplified also myself in commentary. All those things stand, but that wasn't but stating these possibilities and acknowledging the successes which the attack did have, because there were some real expenses, it doesn't gainsay the idea that the attack was a relatively minor deal, but because of its concept and because of the general threat, it poses, it was still a very dangerous attack and a very significant one, which brings us to the doorstep of a nuclear conflict. That still remains true. Earl says, when I was young, I spent a lot of time with family on City Island. Oh, Steve Gonzo is here now. Happy to report. When I was young, I spent a lot of time. Please, everybody, share, like, and subscribe if you haven't already, because our attendance is very light here tonight because Dee, who does much of the marketing for these streams, was not able to be here. So when I was young, I spent a lot of time with family on City Island, so little time, okay, a little bit in the Bronx. Okay, I see. So where are you from, Earl? From Yonkers, perhaps, or from some of the areas that are north of the city, or maybe from out on Long Island somewhere. Anyway, let me get on to the next piece. Okay, this piece is not on the consequences of the raid, of the drone attacks and the terrorist attacks. This is by Pepe Escobar, and the title of it is When East and West Can't Meet, between Leviathan, Behemoth, and um, 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 uh, um, um, Mandela. Okay, Mandela. Gotta get the pronunciation of that correct. So this is a report on the ASEAN GCC China Summit. GCC again refers to the nations of the Persian Gulf, which took part in the summit. The first ever ASEAN China GCC Trilateral Summit was a de facto celebration of a new Silk Road spirit. The first ever ASEAN China GCC Trilateral Summit earlier this week in Kuala Lumpur. With 17 global South nations at the table, was a de facto celebration of the new Silk Road spirit. The Malaysian Prime Minister and current ASEAN Chairman Anwar Ibrahim summed it all up, quote, from the ancient Silk Road to the vibrant maritime networks of Southeast Asia to modern trade corridors, our peoples have long connected through commerce, culture, and the sharing of ideas, unquote. That inspires a lot of reflection, says Pepe. Let's try a first succinct approach, mastering East and West and what divides them. Guided by an extraordinary study, La Méditerranée Asiatique, from the 16th to the 21st century, by CNRS Research Director Francois Gipelou, also a specialist in the Chinese economy. The European tradition is far from a monolithic one, and it's only part of the picture when it comes to global perceptions about political philosophy and the conception of the state. There are stark differences even when referred to Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. The heart of the matter used to be the land-sea opposition. For Carl Schmitt, land/sea relates to friend/enemy, the matrix of politics providing a key interpretation of world history, yet only one among many. It's on continental, quote-unquote, Europe, to borrow the Anglo terminology, mostly in France and Prussia and not in England, that the Hobbesian concept of the state actually materialized. Britain became a world power thanks to its navy and trade, eschewing the characteristic institutions of the state, such as a written constitution and a legislative codification of war. It's interesting. When England became a world power in the 18th century, it was not due to the size of its army. Okay, it was not due to the weight of the population of uh, uh, the British Isles. It was due to the Navy, okay, and due to trade. When you look at population statistics during the Napoleonic Wars, it's quite striking that the population of England was only roughly 8 million people, if I recall my history, while the population of France was 33 to 35 million people. And the population of Russia was already up to something like 52 million people. So England in population was a dwarf compared to, the European powers. Prussia did have a fairly small population itself, but they were very militarized, highly militarized, as a result of, Frederick the Great and what he had done to Prussia in the 18th century. But going on with the article, I digress. I just had to digress because it was always amazing to me how the English were able to dominate, able to win, the Napoleonic Wars, really, with such a relatively small population. Truly amazing. Anglo-Saxon international law, in fact, voided the continental conception of the state and also war. According to Schmidt, it developed its own concept of war, an enemy, those are both in quotes, out of maritime and trade conflicts, which did not make a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. When it comes to its lasting legacy, think, quote, the war on terror, unquote. My war is just because I said so. That's the subtitle of the next section of the article. The opposition then solidified between the right to wage war on land. War is, quote, just, unquote, if it happens between sovereign states via regular armies and sparing civilians, and waging war on sea, which does not imply a state-to-state situation, or relation. What mattered was attacking the trade and the economy of the enemy. And methods of total war were directed against either combatants or non-combatants. That's a very interesting fact, I think, by Pepe there. That led to a new Western concept of, quote, just war, unquote, international war, when the enemy is turned into a criminal, juridical, and moral equality between belligerents is shattered. That's the perverse logic behind psychopathological genocidals, legitimizing destruction of Palestine. These differences in the formulation of war came out of two different conceptions of space: closed overland, featuring sovereign states, God bless you. Thank you. Territorially delimited, and open over the seas, a unique space, unlimited, free of every state control, where primacy is about securing communication links. The British did not think about space in terms of territory, but of routes of communication, just like the Portuguese and the Dutch before them. By the way, two other nations whose populations were very small compared to the areas that they dominated. But that's just a comment of mine added to this. Schmidt identifies in the state an entity linked to land and territory. So as startling as it seems, it's the behemoth, the terrestrial animal of the Old Testament, and not the marine monster, Leviathan, that should have been chosen by Hobbes as a symbol of the state. It's funny, I never looked at it in those terms. I never thought of a Leviathan as a marine monster. I always thought of it as just an absolutist form of government, all powerful, but not because it was a marine monster. Very interesting that Pepe sees it in that way. In the development of the West, three institutional forms equally viable were in competition. Leagues of cities like the Hanseatic League, city-states, especially in Italy, and the nation-state, especially in France. Few across the West may remember that the Hanseatic League and the powerful Italian city-states for at least 2 centuries were viable alternatives to the territorial state. Two top researchers, Douglas North, he was a professor, or is a professor. I don't know if he still is. He was at Stanford for a very long time. I forget whether he went up to University of British Columbia or not. But anyway, Robert Paul Thomas, in The Rise of the Western World, a new economic history, argued that the modern state was imposed on Western Europe because it was the best equipped to fulfill key tasks to efficiently guarantee property rights and the physical security of people and goods. If you go back to Europe in the 14th century, before the Renaissance, there were at least 1,000 states of all sizes. That means no concentration of power and some sort of creative competition in store. There was a reasonable amount of choice for those who wanted to find better places to exercise their freedom. We had, for instance, Germany, with its 3 main actors constituted as the emperor, the nobility, and cities. Also Italy, with its main actors as the papacy, the emperor, and cities. And France, with its 3 main actors as the king, the nobility, and cities. In each case, different alliances spread, proliferated. In Germany, the emperor allied with the nobility against the cities. In Italy, nobility was urbanized and cities profited from endless squabbles. In France, nobility was very suspicious of the bourgeoisie, and the king allied himself with the cities against the nobility. England chose a completely different path. Even before France, the Brits created a centralized state, but under a quite original political setup. Oh, I'd be interested to read, what Pepe thinks about that original political setup. But he moves to Asia now. Asia, and the Mandala state. Asia is a completely different story. Here we cannot use the terminology of state, quote unquote, to designate the political constructions of Southeast Asia before decolonization. In Southeast Asia, the borders were arbitrary between the tribe, so-called, quote, primitive, unquote, political formations from a Western perspective in the state, springing up from political concepts prevailing in India, Islam, and the West. States showed up in the Insulindia, maritime Southeast Asia archipelago, for instance, as a courtly bureaucracies based on a network of complex alliances. Whatever the degree of institutionalization, the distinction between the king, the vassal, and the bandit was tenuous at best. Maybe the Mongols were the bandits. A Vietnamese researcher, it's Nguyen Tay An, has remarked how, quote, political fragmentation is generally the preliminary conclusion of the first of the Europeans who made contact with Southeast Asia. Marco Polo saw in the north of Sumatra, quote, 8 kingdoms and 8 crowned kings. Each kingdom possesses its own language, unquote. China, on the other hand, featured a unitary state imposing a quite efficient form of administration, social order over a vast territory. There was no competition against the centralized state issuing from a landed aristocracy. Okay, no urban type of bourgeoisie, and no military contesting the imperial order as in Europe. That's the major difference between China and the West. Thomas Aquinas decreed that if the power of the king belongs to a multitude, it's not unjust that if the king is deposed or sees his power restrained by this very own multitude, if he turns into a tyrant and abuses royal power. This distinction is completely alien to the Chinese tradition. What happened over the past century or so in China is that the peculiar configuration and competition between local actors and central powers led to what could be defined as an unstructured empire, whose force comes from its shape-shifting borders and the diffuse character of transnational types of networks. In a global economy, this gives China an exceptional projection capacity. When borders become fuzzy and the link between the state and individuals is fuzzy, the unstructured character of this empire allows the Asian periphery of China to develop in an arc from Japan and the DPRK, that of course is North Korea, to Singapore, Indonesia. This is exactly the subtext of some key discussions in Kuala Lumpur at the ASEAN China GCC summit. Jeffrey Sachs totally got the picture beforehand. Now the opposition between a system of international relations deemed backwards and irrational in Asia and modern and rational because based on realpolitik in the West is over. Cultural factors now shape reality in Asia as well as in the West about the conception of the state and international politics or relations. China is finally self-assured enough to start disengaging from the current Western-dominated system of international relations because it has the means to do so. The Chinese concept of harmony in international relations used to be linked to the proclamation of a natural order of which China would be the guarantor. But now we are a long way away from the 18th century, when the international environment of the China of 18 provinces was constituted by Korea, Manchuria, Mongolia, Chinese Turkestan, Tibet, Burma, Annam, the Ryukyu archipelago, and Japan. The Qin dynasty of China was keen to reassert its suzerainty on the political and cultural domains, assuring the protection of China by managing a belt of favorably disposed states. Today, a self-assured China sees a new system of international relations directly linked to a Belt and Road network of geoeconomic opportunities for all. That underlies the relationship between China and ASEAN, GCC, CELAC, Central Asia, and the whole of Africa. welcome to the archipelagic world. The world has surpassed the quote overland unquote or quote maritime unquote dilemma beyond the thinking of um, 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 the McKinders and Mahan. The world is now best defined as Jipalu coined it as archipelagic, linking urban um, 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 nebulas of different sizes and vocations. Globalization accelerated the transformation of a terrestrial world into uh, an archipelagic world. New technologies, economic and financial pressure, disinformation on a mass scale. China is navigating all these rocks in shallow straits in the quest to solidify itself as a global power. All that implies the progressive thalasso-Socratic advance of China, a flexible and tolerant type of empire, quote, community of shared destiny for mankind, unquote, a rich confederation with a capacity of global influence supported by polymorphic communities, the quote, bamboo internet, unquote, of the Chinese diaspora. This is what was on display in Kuala Lumpur and will continue to evolve via an array of multilateral organizations. It is a mandala at work, Chinese style. I think this article is truly a fascinating article. It is very visual in terms of the way it sees things and very creative in how it relates the budding of the networks being created by China, Russia, the GCC nations, the ASEAN nations, the nations of Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's all creating a new world structure. I think it's imaginative to characterize that structure as archipelagic. I hadn't really thought of that. I guess that's the Jipalu construction. In his book. That should be a very interesting one, to read. It's interesting that Pepe also characterizes the advance of China as thalassocratic, seeing China as a maritime power, and not simply a land power, and a thalassocratic power is one in which the power is based on trade relations and maritime. That term actually comes from Athens and its empire in Greece. So he sees China in terms of trade and setting up networks as doing a similar thing to Athens and ancient Greece. It's very interesting to see the analogy and to think about that kind of analogy. And it's insightful in terms of explaining the success of the networks being set up by China and its allies. It's also fascinating to see it characterized, as the Mandela state. because that emphasizes the networking aspect of it and the aspects of the interrelation, okay, of cultures. And it emphasizes also the emergent aspects of it, in contradiction to the other forms of state, the behemoth state, okay, and the Leviathan state, the Mandela-like state is completely different and has to be visualized, in an entirely different way. So I think this article from Pepe is one worth rereading and contemplating, okay, and understanding, because it develops a new understanding of what China is trying to do, or a new interpretation of what China is trying to do, which is very, very useful in terms of thinking through the implications of that. So that's my commentary on this piece. And so Steve Gonzo and the Earl of Lurl exchange greetings. Steve Gonzo says, Shama Sawant's running for Congress. I didn't realize that. I wish her fantastic luck. I think she's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Mr. Wonderful says, Steve Gonzo, greetings. Evelina Upon says, don't remember reading. They were U.S. Personnel. I'm not sure they were. Steve Gonzo says 500 plus operations versus Israeli arms merchants in UK since 2020 by Palestine Action. Hashtag fuck Elbit. I'm not sure of that particular reference, but it's interesting, of course. So let's get to the last piece here. Evelyn says, interesting arching view of Pepe as per China. Yes, I thought it was fascinating, and very important in terms of how to understand what is going on. It's also very colorful and quite abstract, too. It's a good abstraction. So let me share the screen for the next piece, which is also quite interesting. For its implications. This piece is from Un's Review, and it's by Alastair Crooke, of course. On June 2nd, quote, one quiet early morning in Beijing, the dollar's crown slipped. Interesting title, isn't it? Very evocative. And there's a picture of the American flag. I think that's the stock exchange on Wall Street. Should China succeed, the U.S. would lose its, quote, magic weapon, unquote, monetary dominance. Let us hasten the day. That is not really good for the United States. It has not been good for us. It has led us into the sanctions, and it's just ridiculous. Quote, I believe we must start from a notion of defeat leading to revolution to grasp the Trump revolution, unquote. Quote, the experience underway in the United States, even if we don't know exactly what it will be, is revolution. Is it a revolution in the strict sense? Is it a counter-revolution, unquote? I think it's a garbage revolution myself. And I think we have a chance to escape from the flood of garbage. Sorry about that. So spoke the French historian and philosopher Emmanuel Todd in his April Moscow lecture, From Russia with Love. That's a very ironic title. This is, in my opinion, linked to defeat. Various people have reported to me conversation between members of the Trump team, and what is striking is their awareness of defeat. People like J.D. Vance, the vice president, and many others are people who understood that America had lost the war, unquote. The American awareness of defeat, however, contrasts markedly with the European surprising lack of awareness. Rather, it is denial at their defeat. Quote again, for the United States, it is fundamentally an economic defeat. The sanctions policy showed that the financial power of the West was not omnipotent. The Americans were reminded of the fragility of their military industry. The people at the Pentagon know very well that one of their limits to their action is a limited capacity of the American military-industrial complex, unquote. I think there are real reasons for the limited capacity of the American, industrial complex. And to characterize that in very simple terms, when the military-industrial complex came out of World War II into the 1950s and 1960s, it was a democratized military-industrial complex. It was based on conscription. It was based on the draft. It was based on the industrial power that characterized the United States at that particular time. But now, it is based on volunteer militaries, and it is based on financialization, of industry and the exporting, of the industrial power base of the United States to other countries. That's why the capacity, is limited. It can no longer mobilize the American people to expand the military-industrial complex at will. Contrast that with Russia. What Russia has been able to do in the war in Ukraine is to mobilize its people in back of the war, not just for military purposes, but to mobilize its industry so they can outproduce the whole of the collective West. That's the kind of thing we in America used to be able to do. And it's that kind of capability we got rid of in the interest of globalization and financialization. From a military point of view, that has weakened, the United States. But we've never faced that. We have to start facing it now. Going on with the article, quote, that America is in the midst of a serious revolution right now, easily comparable to the end of the USSR, is understood by a few, unquote. Yet our preconceptions, political and intellectual, often prevent us from seeing and assimilating the import of this particular reality, unquote. To his credit, admits the difficulty with perception, theoretically, readily, quote, I must admit that when the Soviet system actually collapsed, I was unable to foresee the extent of the dislocation and the level of suffering this dislocation would cause for Russia. My experience taught me one important thing. The collapse of a system is as much mental as economic. I didn't understand that communism was not only an economic organization, but also a belief system, a quasi-religion that structured Soviet and Russian social life. The dislocation of belief would lead to a psychological disorganization far beyond the economic disorganization. We are reaching a situation of this type in the West today. We ought to remember then that the dislocation that occurred in Russia upon the collapse of communism resulted over the next 10 years, a decade that was characterized by 10 million fatalities in Russia, mostly among the males of Russia. People dying from despair, essentially despair, and alcoholism, because of the economic dislocation that had taken place, but also the mental dislocation that accompanied the collapse of the Russian system of economic and social, the Soviet, I should say, system of economic and social organization. Going on with Alastair, the psychological dislocation caused by defeat, quote unquote, may explain, but not justify the West's curious inability to understand world events. The almost pathological dissociation from the real world that it displays in its words and actions, its blindness, for example, to the Russian experience of history and to the long history behind Shia defiance in Iran. Yet even as the political situation deteriorates, there is no sign of the West becoming more reality-based in its understanding, and it is very likely that it will continue to live in its alternative construction of reality until it is forcibly expelled. Pianist Varoufakis has pointed out that the reality of the prospect of U.S. economic defeat, quote unquote, was clearly spelled out by Paul Volcker, former chair of the Federal Reserve, who when he said that what holds the entire global system together had been the massive flow of capital from abroad, running to more than $2 billion every working day that sustained America's comfortable, low inflationary lifestyle. He might have had here, in spite of the export of the industrial base of the United States to other nations. It was the massive flow of capital from abroad that sustained our lifestyle in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s until the crash of 2008. Today, with the U.S. in an era of unsustainable, structural budget deficits, Trump is laser focused on America's financial core, the Treasury bond market, America's lifeline, and the stock market, America's wallet. Both are fragile, and any external pressure could trigger a chain reaction. This analysis by Alastair here is flawed, and it is flawed because it doesn't take into account that if the Treasury bond market should collapse, that the United States can resort to its monetary sovereignty and its ability to create money without any limit to fund whatever it has to fund. The external pressure could trigger a chain reaction, causing the bond market to begin to collapse. But the Fed and the Treasury working together with the Congress can always supply the necessary financial support to keep the economy going, and going at full capacity if the Congress desires that. Alastair doesn't understand how this would work. Quote, in short, the United States is no longer confident in its own financial fortress. Perhaps not. But the MMT economists are confident in the financial fortress of the United States. And China is no longer playing by the old rules, to go on with the article. This isn't just a trade war. It's a war for the future of global finance, Varoufakis states, which is why Trump threatens war on anyone seeking to supplant or bypass, the U.S. dollar trading monopoly. Well, that's his understanding, and that's why he's threatening war. But he doesn't have to threaten war because it's not necessary for the U.S. dollar to monopolize the future of global finance. There can be many currencies that are used for trade. And the nations that create those currencies can all be monetary sovereigns. It's a different vision from what we see today, but it's a vision that allows all of the major nations to supply full employment and prosperity to their citizens. Going on with the article, Trump's, quote, reciprocal tariffs, unquote, therefore were never about balancing trade. What they amount to is an attempt to restructure creditors. Quote, it's what you do in bankruptcy. This is a really good insight into what's going on. As one commentator wryly notes, demands for greater contributions from NATO states is precisely an exercise in demanding creditor revenue, as was Trump's Gulf trip. The irony of these demands is that Trump doesn't have to make these demands. We do not need to have dollars back from the Gulf states. We don't need to have dollars back from the other creditors of the United States. They can keep those dollars we have given them over a period of time. We do not need any revenue from the creditors because we can create new money ourselves. One way of doing this is to issue $100 trillion coin. Trump can order his Secretary of Treasury to do that. The Secretary of Treasury can deposit the coin at the Federal Reserve, and for various reasons, the Federal Reserve has no choice but to credit $100 trillion into the public enterprise fund account, of the Mint, the PEF, and in turn, almost all of that $100 trillion can be swept into the Treasury general account at will. That does not mean that the administration would be free to spend the whole $100 trillion, because what the Treasury can spend is limited to what the Congress appropriates. So Congress still has the purse strings in that situation. but previous laws passed by Congress had given the executive the power to create the $100 trillion, okay, I speak of, or more, if the executive wants to create that money. So we don't need the piddling amounts of money back from the creditors. That is not something we do. And the idea that the United States is in bankruptcy or close to it is stupid and is due to a lack of understanding of how money can be created by the federal government. It's also due to a lack of reading of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It is, in other words, contemptible thinking. The purpose of the new Cold War primordially consists in choking off China's rise. This aim effectively presents common ground amongst all factions of the establishment, protecting the dollar system from collapse. No? Well, maybe I should put it this way. It doesn't matter if the dollar system fails to dominate all of trade. It doesn't matter from the standpoint of U.S. fiscal sustainability. It doesn't matter from the standpoint of the viability of our economic system here. We will have to adjust to other currencies being important in international trade, but our own will continue to be important for a very long time to come. It will easily support our trading needs, and we do not need any revenue from our creditors, and we do not need to choke off China's rise. That is another false idea that we are running with today. The notion of the U.S. recovering from its former position as a world-class manufacturing center is largely a diversional narrative crafted for domestic purposes. In 1950, the U.S. manufacturing labor force made up 33.7% of the domestic economy, a figure that has dwindled to less than 8.4% today. To revert would take a generational shift. So let us have the generational shift. We can afford to fund that shift here domestically. We can use that $100 trillion to fund that generational shift. And let us make it a Green New Deal shift. That is what we need. And we can support most of our green industry here, okay, in the United States, and create a manufacturing labor force, the size of which can rival the older labor force we had during the 1950s. Going on. So aside from the China consensus, the ruling strata is split, with the likes of J.D. Vance and the economic team of Stephen Mirren and Russell Vogt, concerned more by the risk of U.S. overreach undermining the dollar primacy, whilst the hawks advocate reinforcing the dollar, the hegemony of the dollar, with clear demonstrative, quote, shows, unquote, of the military muscle of the United States. The restructuring of creditors underpins, too, Trump's hurry to do a deal with Russia, one that could bring quick business opportunities and positive capital flows and collateral onto the U.S. capital account. A deal with Iran potentially could even yield Trump's apotheosis of U.S. Energy dominance, resulting in new revenue inflows that would buttress confidence in the dollar. Obviously, based on what I just said, none of this is necessary for our prosperity and for progress here, okay, in the United States. This is a flawed vision that brings us into competition with other nations, unnecessary competition, okay, with other nations. This vision is opposed to world peace and will drag us down in the coming years if we continue with it. In short, Trump's agenda is not long-term strategic. Of course, I agree with that. It is the short-term corralling of aggregate demand for the dollar as the only currency which people demand, albeit even though they do not want to buy anything from the country creating the dollars. That is what we have to change. It would be good if people wanted to buy things from us, especially things that are important in implementing the Green New Deal, not just in the United States, but across the world. The crucial flaw is that Trump's crude transactionalism is shredding his credibility as a serious geopolitical actor and consequently compelling others to hedge against the dollar, actually to hedge against the fall of the dollar. In short, the collapse in credibility caused by Trump's disdain for reading, for intel briefings, and his reliance on the he or she who last whispered in his ear. I didn't know he allowed the she's to whisper in his ear. I think he likes to whisper in their ear, but I don't know if he likes them to whisper in his ear. Anyway, Barney's laughing, lends to policy flip-flops and a general desire for others to disengage as far as possible from the unpredictable Trump land. You can say that again. That's sure what's going on. And by the way, it's really hurting the stock markets. Trump should just stop. Emmanuel Todd warns the classic response to a collapse in the belief system and the particular psyche that has animated the economic paradigm, quote, is anxiety rather than any state of freedom and well-being. The beliefs that accompanied Western triumphalism are collapsing, but as in any revolutionary process, we do not yet know which new belief is the most important, which belief will emerge victorious from the process of decomposition. Let us hope that it is an economic future founded on the MMT approach to economics. It had better be, or we are in very, very deep trouble. Revolutions, though they generally destroy, their focus is to harness the energies sufficient to eradicate the institutions that were too rigid to integrate into the demand for change that provoked the revolution in the first place. In this context, the pursuit of a new Cold War against China precisely is centered around U.S. anxiety, as Todd maintains, primarily the fear that China's building of a digital, quote, superhighway, unquote, for money will prove to be much more advanced than the rickety road that is the American dollar road. Yeah, I agree with that. And that's why we got to change our dollar road so that it too is a digital superhighway. Today, that superwide highway may not be so widely used, that's now, but already there is a migration from the old road to the Chinese superhighway, as Varoufakis underlines to the Chinese. For the American establishment, the Chinese superhighway constitutes a clear and present danger to the hegemony of the United States. The anxiety is not really about Chinese intellectual property or, quote, IP theft, unquote. It is the fear that the U.S. cannot keep up with the new financial ecosystems being constructed by China or the sophistication of the digital yuan. That's the currency, of course, of China. This anxiety is aggravated, not least because the fintech overlords of Silicon Valley are at daggers drawn with the big Wall Street clearing banks who want to preserve their antiquated systems. China has the advantage here as its financial and tech sectors are fused as one. And yes, they're under control of the party. And the party, the Chinese Communist Party, apparently is dedicated to the prosperity and well-being of China. Perhaps because the party has not had its members subject to the bribery that we have here, the Democratic and Republican parties. Once those parties were about the public purpose of the United States too, but not any longer. The fear is plain. Should China succeed, the U.S. would lose its magic weapon, of monetary dominance. By the way, I don't think that's very important. I don't think it's very important to us. If we lose the monetary dominance, we'll be one among a number of nations, that don't have monetary dominance. I don't even think the Chinese are going to have it. And to have an international system where no nation has monetary dominance, that is what we want. And here's a quote. And here's the revolution. No fireworks, no Western headlines, just one quiet early morning in Beijing where the dollar's crown slipped. The world's financial plumbing just got a reroute through the China superhighway, unquote. Quote again. For the first time ever, China's CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system, surpassed SWIFT, SWIFT, in single-day transaction volume. A red banner flashed across Bank of China's HQ at 1:30 a.m. on April 16, 2025. Quote again, CIPS, as Zero Hedge tells it, processed the jaw-dropping, quote, 12.8 trillion RMB. That's the alternative name for the Chinese currency for international trade. In just one day, roughly 1.76 trillion USD. That volume, if verified, overtakes the greenback-dominated SWIFT system in sheer daily cross-border throughput, unquote. And Alastair Crooke ends with, yes, it's all about money. I don't really think, it's all about money. I think it's all about the use of real resources to produce products and services that improve the well-being of us all. In the United States, of all our citizens, but in the world at large, of all the citizens. I think money, is a factor in that, but it's the productive use of resources that is the dominating factor in that. I think the money has to flow. It has to flow because of the monetary sovereignty of all countries, so that countries will not be constrained. They will all be fiscally sustainable. Their constraints will be inflation constraints, but not fiscal sustainability constraints. So I hope that's where we're going to eventually go. And not to a world in which either the dollar or the yuan is dominant over other currencies. I am for a multi-currency world. I am for a multipolar world when it comes to currencies. I will leave you with that thought while I consider the remainder of your comments. I see our attendance has gone up to a decent amount, at least a minimally decent amount. So thank you for that. She says, Elbit Systems Ltd. is an Israeli-based international military technology and defense contract. Yeah, I remember that now. Thank you for reminding me. Lana says, hi all, I've been listening on my TV while eating a late dinner. Well, thank you, Lana, for coming. That point about collecting other countries' dollars with the tariffs is so annoying. To those of us who understand the U.S. government is not a business or a household or an individual state. Thank you, Lana, for making that MMT central point. And Mr. Wonderful says, at Joseph Firestone, another empowering democracy, another great live stream, Joseph, thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Wonderful, but please call me Joe. And Lana Dell says, hi, Steve. Steve Gonzo, yes. So there we are. I think that does it for tonight. This stream is a little shorter than usual. I've been mostly doing 3-hour streams, but Bonnie is shaking her fist like that. She's happy it's a half hour shorter. So that makes me happy too. I will see you all again on Saturday. And in the intervening time, I will get a lot of other work done that, okay, I must get done. But you can count on my being here on Saturday unless the creeks rise. But if the creeks don't rise, I'll be here on Saturday and I'll have the whole rest of the week to construct a great show for you, okay, on Saturday. So I hope you'll come again and you'll like, share, and subscribe, okay, and build the attendance here. We were doing very well on Saturday. We had almost 70 people. Tonight, things calmed down. A lot of that was due to the fact that Dee wasn't able to attend because she is very strong as a marketer for my streams, much stronger than I personally am. Well, anyway, good night all, and thank you for coming, and thank you, Lana, for dropping in and making that comment. I will see you all on Saturday.